and thanks for clicking on the video. In this one, I want to explore the ways that we, as miniature painters, can put our own spin on familiar paint schemes that we all love. If you're like me, then sometimes you don't want to come up with a completely new scheme, but you do want to explore a bit of creativity to make the model uniquely yours. So I'm going to take 3 popular Tyranid Hive Fleets from Warhammer 40k, and I'm going to give each of them a bit of a twist. And I hope this video inspires you to put your own twist on some of the miniatures that you're painting. So let's do this. Firstly, I'm starting with the Leviathan Hive Fleet, and that has a main colour on the flesh of a shabty bone. I'm going to be using whole red and a bit of black to make a shadow colour of that shabty bone that I can use to lay down as an initial base coat. My plan with Leviathan is not too ambitious. I just want to do more contrast and change a couple of the small detail colours. So this one will probably still look a lot like normal Leviathan at the end. And that's a key thing about doing this. I still want these schemes to feel like the original Hive Fleets that I'm basing them off of. After doing a small comparison on the wet palette of adding black or whole red, I decided to add both and make a shadow colour, and then I started applying that to the model, as you can see here. With one layer down on that, it was very patchy, so I had to do a second layer and get a more opaque base coat. The box art Leviathan scheme has a lot of pink. I think it's mainly Screamer pink around the model, so I wanted to do that, and I wanted to use Lamium medium to make up a wash of Screamer pink, and add that all over the top of my dark Ushabti Bone mix base coat. Also, on a side note, at the end of this video, I'm going to be showing a small comparison between some old Tyranid models I painted back in 2021 against these new Tyranids I painted, so it's kind of fun to just see how far I've come as a painter. And with all that covered, I had a really nice pinkish stain all over that, and it was time to come in with pure Ushabti Bone now and start adding that to all the raised areas, leaving my Screamer pink wash in the deep recesses. I should also say, if you're wondering how I know what all the proper paints you should use are that I'm not always using, those I'm getting from the Evi Archive website, which is a fantastic resource for painters to tell you exactly what paints you need to get box art results. With that done, this is how things are looking at this stage. Unfortunately, I don't own the right purple, so I have to use Sunset Purple from scale 75 for this. So you could count this as a change if you wanted to. I began with a mix of Sunset Purple and black to get a shadowy base coat colour, and then I started applying a highlight of pure Sunset Purple over the top. And once it had dried, it was quite subtle, but it gave me a good chunky highlight to start with. A little tip that I have for you about purple is that sometimes adding things like ice yellow to it can desaturate it, because yellow is a contrasting colour of purple, so you can add a light blue to purple to make your highlights if you want to. And that's exactly what I did here as I highlighted the edges of the carapace. I don't really know what to call them, but all the weird fleshy bits between all the joints and in the guns and arms got a coat of Screamer pink to help them blend in well with the shadows. And I think at this point, I'm getting pretty close to what you'd consider a normal sort of Leviathan scheme, but obviously we've done things a little bit differently, so it will look very similar, but it's not quite the same. For highlights on the Screamer pink areas, I did just add ice yellow, and that gave me a lighter pinkish red that I could use to highlight all of those areas. I mentioned at the beginning of this video that I wanted my version of Leviathan to have a lot more contrast, and so I grabbed a pot of Screaming Skull and I began to work my highlights up from that Ushabti Bone to the Screaming Skull all over the raised areas on the flesh. This wouldn't be enough contrast in the end, so I am going to do another layer of highlights on top of this afterwards. And the paint I'm going to use for that is ivory. The trick with the ivory is to apply a very small amount just to the very tops of the arm muscles and arms and the rest of the hands and things. Some of that previous layer of Screaming Skull and some of the Ushabti bone should still be visible. I didn't want to cover over all the previous layers with the ivory. And as I finish up some of my highlights around the chin and on the face, it's then time to have a little look at what things look like at this stage. I did mention in my last video that I'm still experimenting with lighting, and that is still true in this video, so it's a little bit hard to see the contrast, but in the final shots of this model at the end, you'll get a better look at what the contrast on this model actually looks like. For the small details like the eyes and the weird dot thing on the gun, I decided to go with green instead of the normal yellow that you find on the box art. I think the small green details would just change up the contrast a little bit and just part of my personal preference, really. I tend to find that on any model, picking in the teeth always does a lot for bringing out the face. And that's true of these Tyranids as well. For finishing touches all over this one, I decided to do final extra bright highlights using even more of that light blue added to my purple. And I wanted these to be really tiny, so I was really trying my brush to very lightly touch the edges with small dots. I didn't want this brightest highlight to overpower everything I'd already done. It had to be subtle but visible. For the claws and hoofy feet things, I didn't want to do anything fancy, so I just added some ice yellow to my black to create a lighter grey, and then I used that on 2 layers to highlight all of those parts. And that's it for the Leviathan scheme. It's basically exactly what you'd expect from a Leviathan model for Tyranids, but it's just a little bit different. And I didn't show it, but I added some extra Screamer pink over the gun to make it more pink. I wanted to do a quick show of what the Leviathan scheme on the box looks like next to mine, and here's where you can really see the difference. So yeah, Leviathan, but a little bit different. So next up, let's have some fun with Hive Fleet Behemoth. Or Behemoth? Or Behemoth? Yeah, let's go with Behemoth. So really simple on this one, I just started with Mephiston Red and added a base coat of that. My goal for this one was to create a darker gradient going up onto the top of the limbs under the carapace. So that meant I mixed some black into my Mephiston Red and applied that to all the top. I then did that again, adding more black, and applied that to the top of the shoulders and arms and anywhere where carapace touches skin. This gave me a dark gradient as I moved upwards on the flesh parts of the model. I've always loved the colours on Behemoth, but I always thought that it could do with a bit more of something standing out on the red. So this was how I was going to experiment to make this scheme more my style and my preference. To make the gradient stand out more, I also wanted to make the bottom of all the limbs brighter. So I started by adding Evil Sun's Scarlet, which is brighter than Mephiston Red, and then I started to add Tau-Light Ochre to Evil Sun's Scarlet to get an even brighter orangey red that I could use for the very bottom of the limbs and the very end of the tail. With that completed, this is how the flesh is looking on the Tyranid for Behemoth so far. Now it's time to work on those armor plates. So I did a mix of Sotek green and black, and I used that as my base coat for these armor plates. For highlighting, Every Archive suggests Sotek green, so that's exactly what I used to do my next layer. And when that dried, it turned a lot darker and was much more subtle, and then it was time to do the final layer of highlights, which I did with Baharoth blue. And once again, I was adding it very tinily with little dots just to make sure that it didn't stand out too much, but that it was definitely visible. For a final punch in the face of contrast, I decided to add pure black to the very top of the shoulders. And for even more contrast, I decided to add pure Tau-Light Ochre to the very bottoms of the limbs. For the details like the gun and the bits in the joints, I decided to use a purple. So I was efficient with my wet palette and I used the sunset purple mixes that I used on the Leviathan model to paint all of these parts. I used a white paint for the teeth just to make them stand out massively. And For the eyes on this one, I didn't even deviate from the main scheme, I just stuck with a nice bright yellow. And that's my take on the Behemoth scheme, finished. And personally, I really like the gradient to black on this one. I actually think it adds a lot to this paint scheme so that it aligns more with my personal preferences. And I wanted to do another short clip here where I show my Behemoth in comparison to the box art one. And you can see that they're very similar, which is exactly what I wanted, but that mine's just a little bit different. And now finally, the last but not least of the Hive Fleets that I've selected for this video, Hive Fleet Tiamet. Tiamet is actually one of my favourite Hive Fleets, and I really wanted to spice it up a bit with my own twist. And there were two main goals that I had for this. I wanted to do a gradient the opposite way, so making the legs a different colour as they go down lower instead of up near the carapace. And then I also wanted to do some form of patterning or texturing on this model. The first things I did was lay down a base coat of Incubi Darkness all over the carapace. Then what you can see me do is adding in a very light wash of Rust Grey. That's a very bluish grey, and it just adds a slight bluish tinge to the grey sear base coat that I used for all the skin parts. I wanted to see if exploring darker blues that weren't green blues would be interesting in this scheme, so I began to start adding Imperial Blue as a light wash all over the bottoms of the limbs. I would end up going over this with a slightly more green blue because I didn't realize it at the time, but this scheme really leans a lot more towards greenish blue, and having a more pure blue ended up looking a bit weird to me. But maybe if you were doing this, it's exactly what you're looking for. I don't know. But anyway, the big thing I wanted to explore now was I was going to take a feature from another Hive Fleet. So in the modern iterations of Hive Fleet Kraken, which is the red and creamy beige one, there is this like brown patterning all over the tops of the arms, and I really liked that, and I thought, you know what, Tiamet could do it a bit of that as well. So I carefully dotted some Incubi Darkness all over the tops of the arms. My strategy was bigger splodges towards the top, getting into slightly smaller dots as it goes down. I used Templegate Teal to highlight all of the armor plates on this one. I deliberately went chunky on this highlight, and I didn't really mind that the jump in contrast was quite big here because I had a plan. And that plan involved using a similar dotting pattern on the arm plates of the carapace as well. So I took my dark Incubi Darkness and I began to apply dots at the area where the Incubi Darkness base coat met the Templegate Teal highlight. And with dots all over, this is what the model looked like. And once again, you'll see it better under better lighting in the final clips. I did also want to include a real-time clip of me finishing off the thigh here. It doesn't actually take that long to do this dotting, so even if this might look intimidating for an army, it's really not. And once you've done it a couple of times, you can bang it out really quickly. For a final highlight on the armor plates, I used Ice Yellow to mix into the Templegate Teal and create a much lighter pale green. Once again, I applied this very small to the edges, and this time I dotted a little bit more randomly to help match that dotty scheme that we've already got going on with the patterning on this one. At this stage, I took some Sotek Green, which I already had on the wet palette from my Behemoth Tyranid, and I used this to go over all the little details, and I also used it to cover some of the Imperial Blue that I did previously. I kind of washed it over the top. Because Sotek Green is more of a green blue, but is very different from the Templegate Teal and the Incubi Darkness on the armor, it gave me a much more cohesive color scheme overall, I think. I chose to do some mean red eyes, and then I highlighted up all of the last bits as a last stage, and then before I knew it, I had a finished Hive Fleet Tiamet, but with my own spin. And with some simple bases painted, it's time to look at the final results. So the goal with the Leviathan scheme was to add more contrast, and I think I've done that, and also to change some of the detail colours to green. For Behemoth, it was all about doing a gradient and making the skin go from red to black as it got higher up. And finally, for Tiamet, it was all about making the limbs get a different color as we go down, but also adding all of that patterning all over the top of the model. And I mentioned earlier in the video, I'd show some shots of some older Tyranids I painted. They're not the exact same schemes, but I love looking at the comparisons. One, because it helps me feel better as a painter, but two, because sometimes it's fun to just admire these old models and see a bit of the history of your own hobby. So I'm really happy with this experiment, and I've got 3 Tyranid Hive Fleets with my own spin that I could happily make into armies if I ever wanted to in the future. And I hope that by watching this video, you've been inspired to try out a scheme that you love and make it your own. And as always, thanks for watching, and I hope you'll join me in the next one.